The real reason why the poor stay poor. Unveiling the truth. During my research on this topic, I discovered that there is a culture of poverty, which means that the imperfect choices and behaviors of poor people have made them what they are. This culture links poverty to the path of success, where you finish school, find a job, get married, and then start a family. Very few people who follow this path end up in poverty. There is also the belief that choices are limited by the circumstances of where you live, racism, gender discrimination, and economic displacement. There are some factors that determine the choices of poor people. It is true that not everyone has the same opportunities in life. However, everyone is responsible for their own decisions and choices, and the context in which these choices and decisions were made should not be ignored. Now let's take a look at the real reasons why poor people are poor. 1. Government policies. Government policies should be questioned if they help to make or keep people poor. These include strategies and policies that governments develop with the funds they allocate for poverty reduction programs. Instead of having ineffective debates day after day about which program to increase by a couple of billion or reduce by the same amount, they should implement reforms in certain sectors of the government that primarily harm the poor. For example, people in the United States have social assistance programs they can access for health care and food provision. Not all governments in the world provide the same for their citizens, leaving poor and vulnerable families to slide into extreme poverty. Ineffective governments and policies contribute to extreme poverty because they are unable to provide the basic and necessary infrastructure for the security and protection of their citizens, especially in times of conflict. 2. Education. Numerous studies suggest that the level of education is a determining factor for financial success. In some cases, most poor families cannot afford to send their children to school. They need them to work. Some poor families still do not believe in educating girls. Education can open doors to opportunities, skills, and resources that will help families survive and eventually prosper. According to UNESCO, 171 million people would escape poverty if all they learned from school were basic reading skills. More education would reduce poverty in the world by half. However, some public schools are not doing enough to educate children, particularly those growing up in poverty. These schools attended by poor children have weak educational outcomes compared to schools with affluent students. Despite massive government spending on public schools this week, performance and outcomes are still visible. The same poor families have few alternatives to failing public schools. Some states in the United States have made it illegal to send their children to a public school outside the assigned district. The monotony of government education can be disrupted by effective anti-poverty programs. Parents should have the choice of where to send their children for a good education. They should be given control and not be limited in how they can escape poverty through education. Educational reforms are empirical in moving families out of poverty. 3. Housing. While government policies increase the cost of living, taxes, and trade barriers, this causes stress for families already struggling to put food on the table. Housing policy is a sector we should consider carefully, especially in urban areas. The poor are moving from rural areas to urban cities in search of a better life and work. In rapidly expanding economic cities, there seem to be more opportunities for the poor to find work. However, housing becomes a big problem due to costs. This situation has led to the development of slums in cities. A poor person's income primarily covers rent. Housing policies and zoning increase the percentage of the cost. In some cities, such as New York and San Francisco, zoning costs are among the highest, equal to or greater than 50%. These regulations not only increase the cost of rents but also keep poor people away from places with better schools and more job opportunities. Poor people in developing countries living in slums are now subject to poor infrastructure and minimum wages that do not help them escape poverty. 4. Saving. Saving is extremely important for escaping poverty. Reducing consumption and increasing savings is what the poor should aim for. Banking laws have made it difficult for the poor to access banking systems. Asset tests for public programs do not favor the poor in terms of savings. Social Security reduces opportunities for the poor to save on their own. Current policies must be reconfigured to encourage savings and investments in developing countries. The poor have menial jobs with meager income. Those living in cities survive on daily earnings and save very little for tough times. The structures in place in many countries do not work to improve the lives of poor people, and consequently, the poor continue to remain in the same situation. 5. Economic growth policies. Policies aimed at economic growth, such as lowering taxes and policies that encourage investment and entrepreneurship, can create free markets and improve economic growth, which will increase wealth in society. Encouraging economic growth in a country should include poor people, and they should be participating in the growing economy. Therefore, eliminating barriers like occupational zoning, minimum wage, and occupational licensing rules would be helpful. Different professions require a license to practice in at least one state in the US. These professions include makeup artists, florists, and funeral attendants. These can be barriers that could unlock employment and entrepreneurial opportunities for poor people with low-skilled occupations and prices. Minimum wage laws hinder low-skilled workers from getting that first job. Occupational zoning prevents a poor person from starting a small business in their own home. 6. Criminal justice. It would be correct to state that biases against the poor and their excessive criminalization have increased poverty rates. Additionally, the criminal justice system is part of it. A family with a father in prison is more likely to increase their state of poverty. In the United States, 5 million children have an incarcerated father, and this has contributed to poverty in America. Having a history of incarceration and a criminal record limits the ability to succeed in the job market and be self-sufficient. These criminal penalties are financially and emotionally crushing and destabilize families, marriages, and children. Most slums in developing countries are attributed to criminal activities, so the government does not spend money on security and infrastructure development in such areas. People living here are subject to poverty because they are associated with criminal activities. In case of conflict with violence in a country with slums, these people become the most affected. 7. Climate change. The World Bank estimates that climate change has the capacity to push 100 million people into poverty in the next 10 years. Natural events like floods, droughts, and massive storms have a severe impact on communities, particularly those living in poverty. This is because many poor people rely on agricultural activities for their livelihood. Many poor families usually have only enough food to last until the next season. They have few reserves for periods of poor harvests and natural disasters. When such natural calamities occur, they leave millions of poor people without food and shelter, making them vulnerable to diseases that push them further into poverty. In such situations, recovery is very difficult. 8. Lack of infrastructure. The development of infrastructure improves economic profitability. Good transportation systems, water systems, telecommunications, among others, are important for alleviating poverty. The lack of such infrastructure isolates communities in rural contexts. Living in such places means having scarce or no access and opportunities to go to school, work, and the market to sell and buy goods. It is also costly to travel long distances to access basic services that should be provided by the government. Living off the grid costs a lot of money and makes low-income families remain poor. Isolation is very limiting. The opportunities you would have had are already limited, so low-income families remain in extreme poverty. 9. Inequality and marginalization. There are numerous kinds of inequalities, such as economic and social inequalities, that are affecting many people in the world. For example, inequalities in gender, tribal affiliations, the caste system, marginalization, among others, all mean the same thing. Inequality is the unequal access to resources to keep and lift anyone from poverty. Some inequalities are obvious, while others are very subtle. The voices of certain groups might not be voiced in a community meeting, rendering them unable to make important decisions. These inequalities affect people by making them lose the tools to escape poverty. They make low-income families that are already vulnerable unable to move forward. Inequality leaves people living in extreme poverty. 10. Conflicts negatively affect poor people in various ways. Large-scale conflict with violence in developing countries stops societies. Conflict destroys infrastructure and causes migration, a refugee crisis, as families are forced to leave their belongings and flee. In Syria, for example, 70% of the population lives in poverty due to a prolonged conflict, and it is sad because this was once a country where extreme poverty was very rare. Conflicts and violence also primarily affect women. Female-headed families have become very common because women have difficulty finding well-paid jobs and making decisions in their communities. Their families become extremely vulnerable. Small-scale conflicts with violence also have an enormous impact on struggling communities. A farmer worried about the theft of crops and the destruction of property would no longer invest in planting, and women and children would become targets of sexual violence because they are vulnerable. 11. Lack of livelihood and jobs. Without a way to make money, people will face poverty. It is not easy to assume that if someone wants a job, they can easily get one. In developing countries and rural areas, this is not easy. Many traditional livelihoods that depend on productive lands are affected by conflicts, climate change, and overexploitation of resources like fish and minerals. For example, most of the population of the Democratic Republic of Congo lives in rural areas, and the natural resources of these areas have been and continue to be plundered since colonial times. Conflicts over territorial disputes have driven people from these areas to abandon the lands they depend on for food and money. More than half of the DRC lives in poverty. Discontinuous work and low-paying jobs can make families live in poverty. Having no job would mean that a family could not live without assistance. 12. Lack of clean water and hunger. According to the WHO, it is estimated that 2 billion people do not have access to clean water at home, and 800 million people suffer from hunger. It is thought that poverty causes hunger and prevents people from accessing clean water, but these two factors, hunger and clean water, are the main reasons why poor people are still poor. When a person does not receive enough food, they do not have the strength and energy to work. The lack of food and clean water also leads to diseases like diarrhea, which are preventable. Poor people have to travel long distances to reach clinics and end up spending all their money on medicine. This situation is draining the resources of already vulnerable people. When clean water is available, it is usually very far from poor and rural communities. Women and girls have to walk every day to fetch drinking water. The time they spend fetching water could be used for working, studying, and finding a job to improve their lives. 13. Lack of reserves. People living in poverty do not have means and savings to withstand the storms of life. When drought, conflict, or disease strikes, the few savings or assets they have are used to help alleviate their situation. For example, in Ethiopia, the cycle of drought has caused crop failures after crop failures, leading to a widespread hunger crisis. How do these poor families cope? They take their children out of school, sell their belongings and properties just to be able to eat. This harsh solution helps them survive a bad season, but what about the subsequent communities? Communities that constantly face extreme climate events and prolonged conflicts sink families deeper into poverty and prevent them from recovering. In conclusion, empowering poor people and allowing them to take control of their lives gives them the opportunity to escape poverty. Working with communities to help them address the roots of poverty would be useful. Teaching them how to deal with climate change. Better government priorities and easier access to clean water and adequate education would help vulnerable families escape poverty. We would like to know about your experience regarding the topic covered today. Share it with us in the comments, and, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask them. We will gladly respond. Your like would be a source of satisfaction for us, and of course, Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming publications.